Hello everyone and welcome back to another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys yet again for tuning in. On today's show, we should have a very interesting show dissecting some more fantasy football talk. We are going to be sticking with the player profiles that will come later in the show. We have some kind of nice segments where we look at different position groups and the volatility they present in terms of fantasy implications. We're going to start off with the tight end conundrum that is changing as the position revolutionizes, and also looking at how the recent rise in the wide receiver evolution can lead to rookie wide receivers making some sort of impact for their respective teams. And we're also going to be looking at how some off-season moves might impact fantasy either positively or negatively. So without further ado, let's jump right into the show. But before we even begin, I would ask that you like, follow, and subscribe to the show. It is a huge support to all of us here at the network. We also receive a ton of tips and donations, so if you do feel so inclined, please leave them at the link gsmc.cloud as it pops up on your screen. It's a huge support to both me, my fellow podcasters, and ultimately the network as a whole. So anything you leave is greatly appreciated. Also, if you have any burning questions, comments, concerns about any of my prior segments, or even some segments on today's show, you can leave them there at the link as well, and I will address them at the beginning of the next episode. But without further ado, let's jump right into what should be an interesting fantasy football heavy show. And let's start off in the realm of a very weird position group. The tight end position. Now, over recent years, the tight end position has evolved in ways that people might not even imagine. You always had kind of a top line for what a tight end position represented. You have guys like Travis Kelce, and before him a guy like Tony Gonzalez, who always sat at the top level of the tight end position. Was never truly challenged for, say, tight end 1 status in fantasy, or even as the title for the best tight end in fantasy football. That is not the case anymore. As the position continues to get younger, more deep, more experienced, even guys like Travis Kelce now in their mid-30s, guys like George Kittle also getting up there in age, and now younger guys like Sam Laporta, Dalton Kincaid, even Trey McBride, who's going to have a breakout fantasy campaign in my humble opinion. So, looking at the tight end position is a really intriguing way to break down something that could prove to be integral come fantasy draft time, because when you look at this position, in order to get it right, you have to understand that guys who have been in this position before, have had the experience both in fantasy and in real life, may not garner as much attention as, say, the new kids on the block. Right now, the tight end 1 from last season was a rookie, Sam Laporta. The tight end 1 who, while he did not necessarily have the best tight end 1 season, goes to show that in order for you to truly consider every position in a fantasy draft, you have to look beyond what the position tells you. And what the position is telling us now is that tight ends are going to be a premium position in the next 2 to 3 years. Last year, for example, here's an important stat to know about what the tight end position did. In 2023, the tight ends accounted for their largest share of targets, receptions, and receiving yards ever. Looking at that stat, it's reflected in how we now have to view this crop of tight ends, because if, say, in 2024, the numbers for tight ends, the stats for tight ends, reflect those of last year, then we have to say that, okay, maybe tight ends becoming even more vital. Maybe we can't overlook this position, because in recent years, looking at tight ends was not in the top of your mind. You wanted a player who can set the tone for you, not necessarily a tight end who you might have wasted a pick on. Now, though, we're looking at a crop of tight ends where A, no longer is what one considers to be the best tight end in football right now with Travis Kelce, is not necessarily the number one overall guy in people's minds anymore, and B, a tight end position where there's very little margin for error. And so, the names that I've mentioned, while they are very, very integral to how this position grows, especially guys like Sam Laporta, in order to maintain his status as someone you can rely upon, and guys like Dalton Kincaid, who last year, might I add, had the 4th most regular season receptions. These are the guys who a lot of attention will be put on. And so they need to justify that for me to fully say that the tight end position is not just a conundrum but a dilemma, where you are choosing between the perception of someone, or you're choosing between the aura of someone who you believe still has it but might be a bit stuck in the past, and you want to look forward, because the tight end position right now is a very forward-centric position. They are looking towards the future. Some guys in this league, whether they're rookies or second-year players, are on the precipice of really, really making the tight end position a position that is a force to be reckoned with for many years to come. Now let's go to the other side of the spectrum, the more experienced guys who, while still are in this league, still are doing their thing, might be declining a little bit, and might be guys who you, as a result, can't necessarily rely upon, much like the younger guys. Travis Kelce, for example. Last year, the first time in 7 years that Kelce dropped below a 1,000-yard total, especially for someone who has developed such a rapport and connection with Patrick Mahomes. That is kind of a level of concern, is a cause for concern in terms of how important Travis Kelce has been to this Kansas City Chiefs offense, but also now that he's not necessarily going to be the most reliable player on that squad. Also, let's look at Mark Andrews. Mark Andrews is someone who has been doing this for a long time, but he has a different issue. He did have the 5th most fantasy points per game, but injuries hindered him, and he only played in 10 of them. So, as you can see, both of these tight ends are guys who, through many years, you could come to trust at the tight end position for you and not necessarily have to worry about picking up another tight end, maybe as a flex option, or rotating in and out. It's not the case anymore. Then you have a guy like George Kittle, who had a career best in yards, targets, and yards per reception, but is still in a 49ers offense that, has so many other weapons to consider and develop, that he's going to fall by the wayside eventually. And so that leads to the question: do these 3 core guys, who I consider to be my, at least, top 3 tight ends in the league, have the longevity needed where you don't have to worry about them? Or do you have to consider the fact that guys like Laporta, Kincaid, McBride, who are all up and coming, are going to be guys who can sustain you, or just be blips in the tight end spectrum of things? And so, looking at these players, right? The Laportas of the world and the Kelces of the world. I'm thinking that there's no easy way to pick a tight end for the next fantasy football season, because of the fact that there is no middle ground. There's no one guy who bridges the gap between these younger up-and-coming guys and these guys who have established themselves in the league for many years. A lot of people might think George Kittle is that guy, but I don't think so. I think that George Kittle has proven himself to be in that upper echelon of tight ends. Also Mark Andrews as well. There truly is a core 3 in both aspects, both with the younger guys and both with the older guys. And so that dynamic really leaves me struggling to comprehend how people will view the tight end position, because it's going to be a difficult position, especially considering the fact that tight ends could potentially become a skill position group that might be the first off the board. That sounds weird to say, but you definitely don't want that position to be left to desire, mainly due to the fact that you can't necessarily find one player who's going to bridge the gap between two different worlds. And so it's going to be an interesting debate to discuss over the next couple of years, because I could be sitting here telling you this, and in 2 years' time I could look like a fool, because either the tight end position has declined so much, or it has ascended to the point where no one's worried about this position group. And so it's ultimately up to us as fantasy managers to realize the fact that before this tight end market gets even more murky than it already is, you have to pick your poison here. You have to pick a route and stick with it and hope that it develops into something you can rely upon, because there are two divergent paths. There's two forks in the road. One represents the future and one represents the present. And whichever you choose ultimately is going to be how the tight end position is viewed for many years to come. And it's a very daunting challenge, because you kind of have to get it right in order to really truly build something in your fantasy team that stabilizes it for what your vision is. But that should just about do it for this segment. I really like this segment because it kind of dissected this entire skill position group, and I really hope you guys like it too. But coming up next, we do another deep dive into a position group, specifically the wide receiver groups, and how this young crop of rookie wide receivers can truly change and revolutionize that position in terms of fantasy. We will be right back to discuss that and more on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.